This is Leader Time by FedNet, your podcast source for remarks by Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Democratic Leader Chuck Schumer on the Senate floor. On June 18th, Thune praised the Finance Committee's contribution to the budget reconciliation package for making 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent and preventing a trillion tax hike. Thune added that the bill would increase the child tax credit and introduce new relief for tips, overtime, and more, arguing that the plan would boost long-term economic growth and generate in new revenue. The following material is protected by copyright.
Mr. President, on Monday afternoon, the Senate Finance Committee released the text of the centerpiece of our reconciliation bill, making the tax relief we passed in 2017 permanent. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act reduced tax rates for every income bracket, doubled the child tax credit, and nearly doubled the standard deduction. And that, of course, meant more money in Americans' pockets. But those lower tax rates and the larger standard deduction and the child tax credit are set to expire at the end of this year. And if we don't take action, American families will be facing a massive tax hike starting in 2026. Americans making less than $400,000 a year would face a $2.6 trillion tax hike. A typical family of four making $80,000 a year would need to send an additional $1,700 to Uncle Sam. $1,700, Mr. President. Republicans promised the American people that we wouldn't let that happen. And with the release of the Finance Committee's text, we are one step closer to delivering on that promise. Our bill will extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act's lower tax rates. It will extend the doubled child tax credit. It will extend the nearly doubled standard deduction. But not just extend them, Mr. President, make them permanent. Extending the lower tax rates or the standard deduction was never going to be enough for Republicans. We are making the lower tax rates and the doubled child tax credit and the increased standard deduction permanent so that American families do not have to worry about another looming tax hike a few years down the road. And we're actually going even further by increasing the child tax credit by another $200, again, on a permanent basis. And, Mr. President, that's not all we're doing. We're also going to make life better for the American people by growing our economy. In addition to cutting tax rates for hardworking Americans, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also implemented a historic reform of the business side of the tax code. We lowered tax rates for owners of small and medium-sized businesses, farms, and ranches, and made it easier for them to recover the cost of investing in their businesses, which in turn freed up cash for them to invest in their operations and their workers. We lowered our nation's massive corporate tax rate, which prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world, to make American businesses more competitive in the global economy and empower them to invest in wages and benefits for their workers. And we brought our international tax system into the 21st century so that American businesses would no longer be operating at a disadvantage next to their foreign counterparts. And, Mr. President, it worked. In the wake of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, our economy grew at a substantially better rate than projected. Real wages increased, unemployment fell to a 50-year low, the poverty rate fell to the lowest level ever recorded, business investment increased. Everywhere you looked, there was positive economic news. Now, Mr. President, when we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we were able to make some of that business tax relief permanent. But like the individual tax relief, other provisions have either already expired, are expiring at the end of this year, or in the process of phasing out. That includes lower tax rates for small and medium-sized businesses, the Section 199A small business tax deduction, and full expensing for new capital investment in domestic research and development. Our legislation will permanently extend these key provisions. And between these and other new pro-growth policies, like a provision to boost domestic manufacturing by implementing full expensing for new factories and factory improvements, we can expect to see further economic growth and more jobs and opportunities for American workers. The Council of Economic Advisors, which accurately predicted the economic and wage growth that we achieved in the wake of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, is forecasting 2.9% to 3.5% long-run GDP as a result of our legislation. And, Mr. President, that means more jobs, better wages, as much as a $13,327 increase for a typical family, and more opportunities for American workers. It also means more revenue for the federal government, but revenue created the right way, through economic growth, not through higher taxes. And I should mention that yesterday the Congressional Budget Office released a new H.R. 1 analysis, which characteristically, I should say, underestimates the economic growth and hence the revenue that this bill will provide. CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office, did the same thing with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, when it estimated revenues would be $1.5 trillion lower than what they've actually been. The Council of Economic Advisors, by contrast, which was most accurate in its modeling of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act effects, including its effect on revenue, tells us that passage of our legislation will increase federal revenues by $4.1 trillion more than enough to offset the CBO's deficit estimate. Mr. President, in addition to promising to make the 2017 tax relief permanent, President Trump outlined multiple other tax proposals on the campaign trail. Proposals which were endorsed by the American people with his strong win in November. And with this bill, we are delivering on those promises. We're suspending taxes on tips for millions of tipped workers. We're suspending taxes on overtime for millions of hourly workers. We are suspending taxes on auto loan interest when you buy a new car manufactured in the United States. And we're increasing the standard deduction for millions of low and middle-income seniors, making their retirement a little easier and more prosperous. We're also implementing a program to create savings accounts for newborns with an initial deposit of $1,000 to help parents save and invest for their children's future needs. Mr. President, everything we're doing in this bill is for the sake of making America stronger and more prosperous. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to the tax portion, the centerpiece of our bill. The tax provisions in our bill, from the permanent extension of the lower tax rates to the increased child tax credit to the permanent tax relief for small and medium-sized businesses, will help bring security to American families and prosperity to our country. Working Americans, Mr. President, are going to have a better life because of this legislation. And I'm proud to be a part of permanently extending and upgrading the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. With that, I want to thank Chairman Crapo and his members on the Senate Finance Committee for their incredible work on the tax portion of our upcoming bill. And I look forward, Mr. President, to delivering permanent tax relief for hardworking Americans and American businesses in the very near future.
Schumer discussed transgender rights and a classified briefing on conflicts in the Middle East. He then criticized Medicaid and rural hospital cuts, deregulation of silencers and rifles, judicial constraints, tax cuts, defunding Planned Parenthood, and more under the reconciliation package. Finally, he opposed the nomination of Rodney Scott to lead Customs and Border Protection hours before a vote to confirm Scott.
Mr. President, the MAGA Supreme Court majority seems to have forgotten one of its jobs is to protect Americans from discrimination. The Republican cruel crusade against trans Americans infringes on the rights of parents, the rights of kids. Once again, Republicans use these issues to divide America and distract them from their plans to rip health care away from millions of people. We will keep fighting to protect the rights of all Americans. Now, on a classified briefing. As the conflict in the Middle East continues, all of us are concerned for the safety of U.S. troops and citizens and America's interests around the world. For the information of my colleagues, I have requested a classified briefing on the situation in the Middle East, and I believe we will get one soon. I will keep my colleagues informed as more updates arise. On the CBO report of late yesterday, The more and more people look at more and more as people look at the Republican so-called big beautiful bill, the uglier and uglier it actually gets. Yesterday, the CBO updated their projections on the impact of the House bill on our national debt and on our economy. The results are dismal. As the New York Times put in a headline, House policy bill would add $3.4 trillion to debt, swamping economic gains. This analysis is new and different because, unlike their last projection, the CBO studied how the Republican bill would interact with the economy. How many times have we heard from Republicans that we shouldn't listen to groups like the CBO because what they're doing so much stares in the face of truth? They don't want to hear the truth because when people hear the truth, they don't like what Republicans are doing. So they shoot the messenger. CBO doesn't have an axe to grind. No. And their scores have always been accepted by both parties until now. So the bottom line is our Republicans try to discredit CBO because they don't like hearing the truth. But the truth must be told, and we are telling that truth to the American public day in, day out. And we are telling them that these analyses ignore the economic benefit that supposedly come from the outrageous billionaire tax cuts. Well, now we know that even after you take into account any impacts, any economic impacts, the so-called dynamic scoring created by the Republican bill, it is still a loser for working and middle-class families. Only the wealthy gain. The Republican bill will send interest rates higher, particularly 10-year bonds. And you know what that means? It means Americans will pay more and more for virtually everything. When interest rates go up, which the Republican bill will do because it makes the deficit even bigger, it'll be more expensive for the working family to buy a home, a car, send kids to college, run a business, everything. The latest CBO report is a warning to Senate Republicans. Doubling down on the House's reckless spending will doom our kids and grandkids to a life of higher cost. They should scrap the big, beautiful bill entirely and start over. But amazingly, Senate Republicans didn't moderate the House bill at all. No. If anything, they made it worse. It's hard to believe it could get worse than the House bill for working families. But the House, somehow, the Senate Republicans, they're supposed to be not as extreme as the House Republicans, but in this case, more so. After weeks of hearing from one Republican senator or another saying that they'd fix the House bill, that they'd moderate the most extreme elements, what Senate Republicans came up with is just as bad or even worse. The Senate Republican bill is simply put, bigger cuts, bigger betrayal. So today, let's look at 5 ways. There are many, but let's look at 5 ways the Senate Republican bill is just as bad or even worse than the House version. First, health care. The House bill already proposes the biggest Medicaid cuts in U.S. history. Their bill would rip health care away now from 16 million Americans, make over $1 trillion in health care cuts. The Senate bill would add even more roadblocks for working Americans, even parents, preventing them from getting health care. This bill is just repeal and replace by another name. And the Senate bill squeezes hospitals even harder, particularly rural hospitals. It crushes health centers and decimates rural hospitals. Are my Republican colleagues going to vote for a bill that's going to close a good chunk of their hospitals in rural areas? We have a lot of rural places in New York, and let me tell you, in many of those rural counties, the hospital is the biggest employer and the only provider of health care. So why take them away, especially to give tax cuts to billionaires? Makes no sense, and the American people know it makes no sense. It's vicious. It means fewer resources for hospitals to stay open and pay their staffs. And one other thing, even if you don't have Medicaid or even ACA, your premiums are likely to go up because of all these changes in health care. Second, Second of the five of the worst things in the Senate bill are clean energy jobs. Senate Republicans spent weeks promising they'd ease the clean energy cuts passed by the House. But the Senate Republican energy package is a total head fake. It's not real. The Senate Clean Energy Bill cuts the cuts in the Senate Clean Energy Bill are every bit as destructive as the House proposal. It phases out tax credits for wind and solar projects within 6 months. An estimated 850,000 people in the clean energy industry will lose their jobs. Add that to the million or more who will lose their jobs in health care and the hundreds of thousands who will lose jobs in other areas. Guess what? When you lose 2 million jobs plus, you're heading towards a recession. Is that what our Republican colleagues want to do, all to help their billionaires? Billionaires won't mind if there's a recession. They got a big cushion. But what about working families? Harder to get a job, harder to keep a job, harder to pay for increased costs. It's amazing what they're doing. And to boot, these energy cuts are going to surrender U.S. energy independence to China. Solar is the quickest, cheapest way to put new electrons on the grid. You cut it out, China will dominate, and they will then dominate the world in terms of solar, and they will have the American consumer at their behest. And if you think they're going to charge the Chinese people the same they're going to charge American people, forget it. Even worse, while the Republicans are gutting clean energy, they're giving special tax breaks to the oil and gas companies. Oil and gas will be the one industry that doesn't have to pay the alternative minimum tax. Is that incredible? So they don't like tax breaks for solar, but tax breaks for the oil companies are great? That's not an all-of-the-above strategy, which so many of my colleagues talk about. And let's not forget, AI has huge energy demands. It is going to push up the costs for Americans. So why cut off the fastest growing, cheapest, and quickest to construct source of energy, which is solar? It's all ideological. It's beyond rational economics, even by the Republicans' love of fossil fuels. It is simply that these right-wing billionaires from Texas and Oklahoma who made a fortune in the Permian Basin, the Anadarko Basin, etc., hate clean energy because they know it's the future. And Republicans, at the cost to hundreds of millions of Americans, are bowing down in obeisance to them. Third, and this one's very important because it has not gotten the attention it deserves, the Senate bill somehow manages to cater even more to the radical gun lobby than the House. For those who may have missed it, and many did, in the House bill, Republicans snuck a devious provision that reverses a century of safety rules on silencers. We know that silencers are used by people who don't want people to know they have a gun. Not by police, not by average citizens, but by criminals. People who go shoot up mass shootings, they don't want people to hear their shots. And in one case, it's known that they used a silencer and killed more people. But Senate Republicans go even beyond that. Refusing to be outdone by their House colleagues, they made it even worse in a dramatic way. They decided to drop regulation and background checks on not only silencers, but shotguns and rifles. For 100 years, we've had these on the books, these laws on the books for gun safety. This is stunning, terrifying, and just totally idiotic. To the extreme Republicans who slipped these gun provisions into their bill, shame on you. Shame on you for putting the gun lobby over the lives of kids. Shame on you for endangering our families and law enforcement. Shaming on you for adding fuel to America's gun epidemic. As many of you know, I'm the author of the Brady Law. I got it passed in the House in 1994, as well as the assault weapons ban. And there was always a tradition, not shotguns, not rifles. And that's broken by this extreme and dangerous provision that the Senate has added to the bill. We're going to fight this provision and the provisions on silencers with everything we've got, including in the birdbath process, where we believe this provision has no right to be in a reconciliation bill. It's not a revenue raiser. It's policy. It should be knocked out. Fourth, the Senate bill took House Republican attacks on our courts and dialed them up even more. Right now, the Trump administration is losing in court about 95% of the time when its actions are challenged as unlawful. And there are so many actions that the Trump administration is doing that is unlawful. And they're losing. And it's not just liberal or Democratic chosen judges who are knocking these things out. A lot of them are Republican judges, and a good number are Trump-appointed judges. But they're doing their job. They're obeying the law. They're telling the Trump administration, you cannot break the law. Right now, because Trump is losing 95% of the cases, even from his own appointed judges, he's defying the courts with more and more frequency. And Republicans in Congress want to codify the Trump administration's attacks on the courts. The House bill, for those who remember, would have prevented courts from enforcing their injunctions if plaintiffs didn't put up massive security bonds. The Senate bill goes even further, remarkably and disgustingly enough. Senate Republican bill wants to prevent courts from even issuing injunctions against the federal government in the first place if plaintiffs don't put up massive security bonds. In other words, Senate Republicans want to turn our justice system into pay to play. If you can't put up the money up front, then no injunctive relief against the abuses of the federal government, even though those abuses are at a record high. It's a naked attack on checks and balances, a disturbing escalation against judicial independence. Finally, debt and taxes, the subject we are focusing on this week. Senate Republicans, through their proposal, want to pass some of the largest cuts for the ultra-rich in American history and then ruin our children's financial future by making these tax cuts permanent. If Republicans make Trump's tax cuts permanent, our children and grandchildren will be condemned to a lifetime of higher interest rates, higher costs, and diminished potential. Why are Republicans doing all this? Well, we know what their North Star is. Tax cuts for billionaires. They tie themselves in knots. They do terrible damage to their constituents in so many ways, all so they can give tax breaks to the wealthy. This is the big difference between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats believe in lowering taxes for working families and the middle class, parents raising their kids, small business owners trying to grow. Republicans, meanwhile, believe in helping those at the very, very top, even at the cost of dooming our children and grandchildren to a lifetime of debt that Republicans only selectively care about. They believe that helping billionaires and big corporations is somehow going to make everyone better off. That's never worked. When you put it all together, the Senate version of Donald Trump's big, ugly bill is even worse than the House. It makes even deeper cuts to health care. It destroys American clean energy. It raises costs on working and middle-class families, and it rewards those at the very top at the expense of all the rest of us. Finally, on the CPB nomination, today Senate Republicans will confirm Rodney Scott as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CPB. It's hard to imagine a worse, more unqualified, more dangerous choice to lead the CPB in this moment than Mr. Scott. His lack of experience alone is enough to disqualify him from the position. But there's even more. During his time at the Border Patrol, Mr. Scott was directly implicated in the alleged cover-up of the death of someone in Border Patrol custody. These are the people Donald Trump seems to like, people who break the law. He likes that. And there's another one. When pressed by the committee about these allegations, Mr. Scott described his actions as routine. Cover up the death of someone who was in custody, that's routine? This is sick. This is a person who may have covered up the death of someone in the Border Patrol custody, and now Republicans want to put him in charge of border security? No one who allegedly covered up a wrongful death at the hands of law enforcement should ever be named to a position of leadership. The Senate should reject his nomination. And while at a time when the Trump administration is snatching people off the streets, conducting military-style raids across America, and demonizing immigrants, Mr. Scott would be nothing more than a rubber stamp for some of Donald Trump's nastiest, cruelest immigration policies.
This program is copyrighted by Federal Network, Incorporated, and provided only for informational and educational purposes. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or use of this episode without expressed written permission from FedNet is prohibited. Thanks for listening to this FedNet podcast. You can watch live action from Congress on our YouTube channel at FedNet TV.